Welcome to this podcast. I'm a repeat security entrepreneur. With me, I have two operational CISOs. Ganesh has been a hands-on operational CISO in the technology industry. He's also a repeat entrepreneur.
Hey everyone, name is Ganesh Krishnan. My background is primarily also as a cybersecurity practitioner for 2+ decades. I was a CISO at companies like Yahoo, LinkedIn, and Atlassian, and then have done a couple of companies since.
And we have Dylan Hack, hands-on operational CISO in the healthcare and life sciences industry.
My name is Dylan Hack. I've been in the IT industry for about 26 years. The last 15 plus years have been in cybersecurity. And I spent a lot of time with life sciences, healthcare, other types of companies. Right now, I'm an operational CISO looking after basically a security program for companies that I work with.
We're going to talk about human-centered breaches. So folks, let's get started with the discussion, right? So Verizon 2024 data breach states that 68% of the breaches involved a non-malicious human element. For most of the CISO community, most of the security community, that's not a surprise. And we all know that's like a person falling victim to a social engineering attack or making an error, right? So as you guys essentially put on your operational CISO hat on, what are your reactions to these findings, right? I mean, more importantly, why does this happen so frequently? Is the human element overlooked issue by the security community? And what can the CISO and the security community do about it? Maybe Dylan, we get started with you.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a lot more common now for people to be involved with accidental or negligent types of data breaches. And a lot of this is often inspired with like phishing emails and other types of attacks. There's just so much technology out there today, and it's difficult for the average user to keep up with it and the risks associated with it. So it's a very true statement. I've definitely seen an increase in this the last couple of years.
Ganesh, what's your take on it?
Yeah, this is a, when I heard this stat several years ago now, it's basically alarming and jaw-dropping. In my prior life as a CISO, we focused a lot on outside in, how do we prevent the attackers from getting into our walls? What this stat says is you kind of have to flip that on its head. Say, hey, the outsiders are actually trying to already inside your walls, trying to hack your employees, because that's the easiest way for them to get in. And so while this is not surprising, when you hear that 68% of security risk is related to insiders, that would be jaw-dropping to a lot of folks, because that's not where the investment goes in cybersecurity.
Dylan, when you think about this, how do you look into the broader landscape of user risk? What are the different kinds of user risk, right? And which kind of user risks get most attention in a typical enterprise and which ones actually don't? Can you shed some light on that?
There's a lot. Obviously, we've got some insider risks that probably will get highlighted by HR or illegal. For example, if there's some suspicious activity that somebody is perhaps saving some intellectual property or other types of sensitive data to their own cloud. But there's a lot of accidental potential risks also, because people are dealing with so much data these days. It just takes one mistake to send social security numbers to the wrong email address. And then there's those that with this big push, everybody's moving or has moved to SaaS applications. Mm-hmm. Everything has plugins. There's a lot of different connections. These days, I was looking at my password manager. I have somewhere in the lines of like 130 passwords for different types of applications, which in IT, that's what happens. But for the business users, they may be managing access to 50 or at least 40, 50 different kinds of applications at times. In the push to move forward with technology, there's an increase of different connections, APIs, other types of data it's intricate, it's everywhere, right?
So we have a hyper collaboration going on. Basically, people are communicating, collaborating internally within enterprises, outside the enterprises. There are sort of negligence happen. And then from your perspective, just sticking on to one of the questions is, which one gets most attention? Insider clearly is malicious intent. Accidental and negligent is not malicious intent. But from your standpoint, where have you seen security teams focus most of their attention on? And are there areas that they haven't not had either bandwidth or resources to focus on?
I mean, in my experience the last couple of years, it's about what you know and what you don't know. So the intentional insider risks do get the most attention because these are things that people see or notice. The accidental divulging of information or accidental clicking on a link and nobody tells the other person, oops, I did this. Can you check to see if my account's compromised? Those go hidden, right? And often we don't hear or find out about those things until well after it happened in the first place, and the damage is obviously already done.
Got it. Ganesh, you worked as a security practitioner, as a security leader in some very, high growth, fast moving, software enterprises, data driven enterprise. What's your take on this whole issue of, user risk, insider versus accidental versus negligent?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything Dylan said. I think that the first thing that comes to mind when we use the term insider risk is malicious employees. For example, employees stealing data right before they leave, or there's a layoff that's happening. I mean, these are cases that Dylan alluded to as well. What definitely goes unnoticed, one of the primary reasons is there isn't enough data of how much of this is going on. No one's actually capturing this and associating mistakes to people. So not to blame them, but the organization can actually understand what their risk is and what they should do about it, right? And some examples of accidental risk could be simple things like, you might have heard of credential stuffing attacks. Like, human beings reuse passwords. So if an employee uses the same password on a third-party site, the same password as their corporate password, then if the third-party site gets compromised, the passwords get posted on dark web or on the internet, the organization is also at risk, right? So that's a great example of accidental risk. Negligent could actually be, there are examples there where it could be a result of security controls that the organization is placing on employees. Employees feel overburdened because they want to get their job, right? So a simple example may be, let's say an employee needs to share a document with a business associate, with a business partner firm or a person, but the company has blocked sharing. How are they going to do that and get their job done? And their boss is asking them to do this, is they're going to download the document onto their machine. They're going to upload it to their personal Google or Microsoft Drive and then share it with the business partner. That's a classic example of a negligent action by an employee, not because they're malicious, but because they want to get their job. And a lot of this goes on as well. And it gets, again, there's no data about how much of this is going on.
Dylan, from your standpoint, you're supporting various kinds of business functions within healthcare, within life sciences, and other industries. And business needs to move fast. And in this type of environment, how can CISOs and their teams have effective, conversations with the business counterparts? Because there could be a data sharing risk. There could be a whole bunch of, rogue applications sitting on people's devices that might be spoofing sessions, what have you, right? We got tons and tons of examples out here. What's the best way to have user security conversations with your business partner or counterparts, right? Mm-hmm. And do you have any best practices or examples you can share on that?
Yeah, when it comes to making decisions and talking with the business counterparts, especially at the C-suite level, it's really important to have meaningful data. In itself is the challenge. If you're in a multi-cloud environment and you're using a lot of SaaS applications and maybe Office 365, and then you've got plugins and other APIs, there are all these different points of entry for people to bring in data, send out data, and as Ganesh mentioned, even share through other means like with Google sharing, Google Drive, OneDrive, all that kind of stuff. So the challenge I see from a lot of CISOs is really how to get all that information into one package that you can go to the business. And once we do that, once we have that information, then we can set some guidelines around, like, this is how we need to share our data. This is our approved tool or approved solution. And try to reduce that. But at the same time, there's always going to be a mindset with users of, hey, well, that's too restrictive. I want to share it this way. And then they may go off and make those changes on their own. So it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. There's a lot of data points, and trying to find a solution that can bring that all together is really important.
And how important, Dylan, on that point is, like, I'm sitting on a business side right now, and we are having a discussion with my security counterpart, and we see a lot of, essentially, there are individuals, including myself, let's say, with higher level of privilege, and then you see the conversation that your security counterpart is having, like, hey, we got this security control, we got this data sharing, we got this blah blah blah. It can be fairly contentious, may not be the right word, or it can be a fairly tough conversation to have. Can you share a little bit about what data sets do you need to have? You, and then Ganesh, the same question for you. Like, what kind of auditable data do you actually need to have this conversation?
Yeah, I think you need to have a very good understanding of how data is being shared and where data is flowing, then you can have those meaningful conversations around are we approaching this the right way? Obviously, we don't want to stop the business from moving, and we actually want to encourage the business to move even faster, especially in a competitive environment. At the same time, we have to be realistic and address those risks as what does this mean for us? If this data gets out to the wrong hands, is it a big deal or is it not? And can track over and over and over.
Right. So understanding how data is flowing within and across the enterprise, number one. Number two is what is the impact if this data gets into the wrong hand? Also understanding what are the different vulnerability vectors that could actually impact the data from a user standpoint. Ganesh, what's your take on this? Any examples you could share on this? Right. Sorry, put you on spot.
Yeah, I think Dylan is spot on. I mean, not a whole lot to add there. Other than saying generally, what I've seen, at least in my past life, security teams tend to take a technology approach, look at a vulnerability, and then say, okay, how do we close this vulnerability? That makes sense, sort of, when you're looking at things that don't affect people or provide a baseline set of security. That's hard to justify when you're talking about affecting business and people productivity, right? So if security teams are to deploy user-specific controls, then that needs to be backed with data, as Dylan said. Otherwise, you could be in a conversation saying, "Oh, I want to deploy MDM on individual on employees, and I want to offer X, Y, and Z." But you have to back that up with data, saying how many unmanaged devices are logging into my network. So then the management says, "Oh yeah, you're actually making data-driven decisions," so that then they can make the right choice about whether they want to deploy technology X or not. So I think having that assessment and data at all times that Dylan said, that back up the controls that you're doing as a security team, and that's the piece that's missing. It becomes easy if there's data to back up.
Absolutely. Ganesh, just building on this, from your standpoint, what kind of user attacks are you actually seeing these days, right? They are becoming more and more sophisticated. Can you talk about the different type of attacks you're seeing? Can you share with us
one recent style of attack I've seen a lot of recently is the type of phishing email that will require someone to enter their user ID and password and also their MFA prompt. The pages that the user is going to looks very legitimate. It's difficult to know that it's a fake website. But once they enter their credentials and their MFA prompt, their session basically becomes hijacked, and now the adversary can log in with those credentials that they are able to gather already. Yeah, it's on the rise. It's very sophisticated. There are ways, once we find out about it, to revoke basically the sessions and have the user re-log in, re-authenticate. But catching that in the first place is challenging.
So you have basically data sharing issues across the board that have been around for almost a decade, especially with the advent of collaborative applications. And now even some of your data marts, data warehouses are essentially also becoming collaborative in nature. So you have a whole bunch of these issues going on in the industry. Then, there is another one that has basically risen up in the last 10 years, and that is basically becoming also mainstream, which is phishing-based attacks, right? Session spoofing. Switching on, Ganesh, on your side, are there any other types of attacks you've seen lately, right, that might be interesting for our audience to hear?
Yeah. I mean, I think building on what Dylan said, sort of phishing and also like MFA, like hacking the second prompt, right? As organizations have increasingly switched to MFA. And then as the MFA door is getting harder, what attackers are now doing, which we are seeing, is getting users to install rogue applications, not just on their machines, but also on their mobile devices, also on their via their browser. So browser extensions also become a key attack vector. And one of the recent examples I saw was an employee installing an application called ChatGPT that wasn't written by OpenAI.
Mm-hmm.
To be very specific. So it isn't employee's fault. They're probably trying to just do their job. But the attackers somehow coerce them to install this from a different source.
So you got rogue applications installed, and the applications can spoof some of your, sessions, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Including MFA sessions. And if the user is a high privilege user, you got a big issue on you. On that train of thought, right? And let's continue the conversation, Ganesh, with you, and then we'll switch to Dylan. So Ganesh, from that standpoint, right, you have this information from various sources, right? And that's our challenge, right? You got a lot of different tools giving this kind of information. How do you actually communicate that very effectively? Like, do you need to unify all this information from a user standpoint? Because that's a fair amount of reporting and number crunching and, exercise And most teams don't have the time or the resources, candidly, right? Who has the time and resources when everything is sometimes looking like it's on fire? How do you solve that problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. The need is to be able to create a source of truth for user/employee specific information. So if we could have a source of truth that could say, oh, here are the mistakes that people are making. Here is what we, here are and from the past, we can actually predict, okay, you know what, for example, employees, like 5% of employees fell for our last phishing simulation attempt within the company. And out of which 50% of them have SMS-based MFA. So if you had that data in a source of truth, what you could say is, hey, these people are key targets for us to move to passkey based, so that we prevent those people from getting hacked in the future through phishing attempts and such, right? Because they're more prone. So the source of truth allows you to understand the data and justify controls, do a risk assessment. Having a source of truth of such information also allows you to proactively put controls to prevent people from getting hacked. And that's really the proactive stance to prevent these human-centered breaches that we keep talking about. All we do today is generic cybersecurity training, which we all know has limited effect.
Dylan, if I can shift the question to you and add a little bit of twist to it. So, source of truth, not easy to do. What's your take on it? Operational challenges on bringing together a source of truth, alerts. How do you even go about slicing and dicing this problem? Any thoughts over there?
The more our IT scope expands into SaaS application and cloud applications, the more effort is required to audit and get the data that you need. So yes, I can get a list of all users in one cloud, the next cloud, and the next cloud. I have to go into each of those. Then I can go to my Microsoft accounts and Azure and get information there. But as we expand with the enterprise into many different kinds of apps, it becomes a lot harder to manage that information. And that's where I feel like something that can bring that together is definitely useful, because while it's not rocket science in order to go to each of those applications, it does take time, and time is money. And in an environment right now where headcount means a lot to businesses, so expansion or non-expansion, we have to use what resources we can. And I don't see that problem getting any easier, to be honest, because there's a lot more point solutions than there ever has been. And they're all SaaS-based, and they all have their own user base and so forth.
So essentially, on one hand, the user risk problem is growing up exponentially. Mm-hmm. The number of monitoring solutions has also gone up exponentially. Every tool has its own, data model. And here you are basically running, security and security operations, among other things. You don't have time to breathe. And now we are talking about standing up a solution which takes, inputs from 5 or 15 different tools, aggregating that, unifying that, right? So that's one part of the problem. Building on that, the second part, if I may, right? There's also this whole concept of alerts, right? And we all know that our teams are exhausted with alert. I mean, how do you even go about, prioritizing the alerts and mapping to alerts that are meaningful, right? I mean, could you talk a little bit about that? And then Ganesh, if you can give your take, that would be great.
Yeah. And I mean, alert fatigue is something that we've been talking about for many years, right? It is true. It happens. And there's some really great security tools out there that will alert you on all sorts of information. But how do you deal with all of that? And it goes back to the scope of the labor that you have available to you that you can use to go through that. In my case, or my approach, I would say, is really looking at the highest alerts. If it's impossible to get to 100% of them, can I tackle the top 80% and then occasionally do some checking on the last 20 from time to time? I'm always interested in types of alerts that could lead to an immediate ransomware and attack, followed by identity and data breaches. Those things are big ticket items that I always will focus on. But there are other alerts, like perhaps some network anomalies are probably not malicious, but should still be investigated. Those would obviously, it's a balance between the two, really.
Ganesh, if you reflect on this, and as you think about your own operational experience, how would you go about prioritizing the alerts, right? You have dealt with this problem also substantially. So could you talk a little bit about, what thought process methodology would you use for your teams?
Yeah, I think, my take on this is that, a lot of cybersecurity products, even today, tend to just you plug in and they generate a bunch of alerts. The problem with that is, when you plug in a tool, it usually doesn't have the full context of the business that you just deployed in. My take on it is that, cybersecurity products should avoid generating too many alerts until they're confident that there's enough context. They have enough context about the business that they're deployed in. And that could be obtained through a few means, right? So you reach a certain amount of data where you can infer and tie things together to generate meaningful alerts. That's one. Second is there should be controls given to security teams who operate these tools to figure out what types of alerts they actually want to get. Instead of you plug something in and it generates like 10,000 critical alerts, right? And then people just tend to give up. So if we can move to a model where, it's not just about throwing a bunch of issues in front of people, but actually figuring out what is relevant, then I think that meaningfully begins to change.
And maybe to Dylan's point, like depends on which attack vector are you concerned about, ransomware attacks or what have you, right? Data sharing, right? Then you can prioritize that. So that's a decent framework. My question, Dylan, to you is the industry ready to have some sort of like a user risk benchmarking score, or is it too early? Because how do you go about saying, okay, the user risk score for this enterprise, let's say, what have you, 7 compared to the industry standard of 5 or on those lines? Have you seen any movement in that activity from the security community to benchmark the user risk score?
Absolutely. No, we need something like that, definitely, because identity is generally the number one entry into an organization, right? And managing that digital identity is difficult as the scope of applications and technology grows. So we need a solution that can bring that all together and have a single point of view. Otherwise, it's not really sustainable to go into every single application and look. You can if you have an army of people that's all they do, which would be great. I think a lot of CISOs would love that. It's just not the reality of life today. So having something that can tie it all together and give us a user identity risk for each user individually and also as a group is something that is would be practical and very useful.
Ganesh, as you think about this, right, dual questions. One is your view on the user risk score. And number 2 is, do you see that being tied to, some of the industry training solutions out there?
Yeah. So I think the user risk score, I think that, going back to my previous point, if you had a repository source of truth of that information, then generating meaningful scores that are relevant to the business becomes easier, right? It still has to be trustworthy. It still has to take into account the right things and give security teams enough knobs to adjust it and fine tune it so that they can make it relevant to their business. So I think, that's definitely an important consideration. In terms of training solutions, I think training is one vector of user risk and mitigation specifically, right? But there are several other vectors, right? So if you can figure out, for example, 15% of my employees are making the same mistake, you might be able to put guardrails in place to eliminate the issue altogether versus just relying on training. So there are much bigger benefits of having a score and a source of truth of that type of information. So I see that fundamentally different from training from that regard.
So conceptually having a system that is a source of truth for user risk, and then essentially having data-driven, conversations with business on an ongoing basis about justification of existing security controls or new security controls. Having a programmatic way to put some guardrails or controls for certain type of users to protect against, Dylan, but you said certain attack vectors that are of high relevance. And then training being also a component of this. That's probably what we're talking about. Gents, I think we are running out of time. Dylan, any parting thoughts to our audience? Ganesh, let's start with you, Dylan.
Nothing specifically. I think this is a topic that needs to be talked about a lot more in the industry. It's a risk that keeps increasing. year to year, and it's also a vehicle and a vector that our adversaries are very much interested in, and so they're thinking about different ways of getting around policies, controls, how to compromise the user, and we need to stay on top of that in the security space also.
I mean, I think first of all, Vikrant, thank you for organizing this. Great questions, spring great conversation. So I think these were all great questions and great discussion. But would completely echo what Dylan said. Right, it's a critical piece of, I believe, running a security program. If we think 68% of our risk is security risk is insider risk, we need to do a much better job of understanding it in a much more deeper fashion and figure out, not just the training we can give to our users, but what we can learn from that data and what guardrails we can put in place. Because that's what really security people are looking for, is how can I eliminate a class of problems? And having understanding your security from a end user and employee perspective is a critical component of that.
Dylan, thank you so much. Ganesh, thank you so much. We'll wrap our session now. Okay.